Well, hello everybody. This is Dr. Stringer. I'm back here this week talking with you all about police patrol. Should be a pretty interesting topic. It's pretty straightforward though. I imagine most of you probably already know some aspects of police patrol to some extent. This is probably not too difficult for you to grasp in your textbook, so I won't dwell on it for too long. So basically what happens with police patrol is that officers are allocated throughout the city, county, whatever the jurisdiction is of the police department. And they're broken up into what's often called a beat or a precinct or a division or so on. And these are usually just small areas of the city that each officer will be responsible for, and possibly even multiple officers be assigned to each beat. And so there'll be the primary officer that's in charge of patrolling that area, as well as responding to calls in that area. In the event that an officer needs backup or something like that, then an officer from a neighboring beat, so to speak, would come and back him up, or possibly multiple officers, things like that. There is something known as triage of calls, so not all calls are really created equal. If you notice, if you've called the police before, if you're calling to report, something that's happened, maybe your bicycle got stolen or something like that, and you don't know when it got stolen, they're not going to treat that as high priority as a burglary in process or something like that, and those higher priority calls will get handled first. So looking at technology and call priority, a lot of police officers nowadays have what is called a mobile data computer. It's essentially a laptop that's in their patrol vehicle. You see a picture of that here, which allows them to access a lot of information from their laptop, such as your vehicle history, your criminal history, driving record, things like that, whether your license is suspended, stuff like that. In the old days, police officers used to actually call all this stuff in over the radio and then have the dispatcher check you for wants and warrants and things like that, and then the status of your license, and then they would get back with the officer and tell them they're suspended or they have a warrant or something like that. There's usually a 10 code that varied across departments for this, because you wouldn't want the dispatcher to come over the radio and say, yeah, he has warrants for his arrest, because that might motivate that person to start running when they hear that. So if they hear that they're 1056 or something like that, then the person standing next to a police officer doesn't actually know what that means. And so computer-aided dispatch also aids in the tracking of calls. So moving along, so some other things to know about that your book talks about is what is known as the 311 number. And so this is a non-emergency number. Large departments tend to have this. I know Baltimore does, and some other larger areas, because so many people call 911 for non-emergency situations. So they developed 311 for people to call 311 instead, because if you think about it, nobody really knows the non-emergency number for their police department. They have one, but pretty much every department I've ever heard of has a non-emergency number, but no one knows that. So they just figure, well, we'll call 911 and we'll get to, the police. The differential police response is also known as pinball policing. This is essentially in a very busy area where officers are, going from one call to another pretty much all night long, perhaps on a Friday or Saturday night when it's really busy. They've also started sometimes using, handling cases or reports over online, or having people come down to the station to file a report versus sending an officer out to fill out the report, which helps to reduce strains on manpower and patrol. So preventative patrol, the outcomes of this, obviously, apprehension through fast police response. You have your dispatch time and your travel time to, actually have the officers get there. very few crimes are actually resolved by fast response. So, it doesn't really tend to matter. Research shows how fast police get there versus getting the crime solved. Your textbook talks about the difference between a discovery crime and an involvement crime, and this is an important part for the differential police response because a discovery crime is something like you discovered that your bicycle was stolen. You don't know really when it was stolen, maybe in a week ago, maybe yesterday, maybe a couple hours ago, who knows. An involvement crime means you're directly involved with the crime. You're not the suspect, but maybe you're the victim, right? So there's a burglary, or you've been raped, or you wouldn't probably, be calling if you were murdered, but maybe you were shot, or something like that. And so involvement crimes tend to get higher priority for police dispatch as well. So the Kansas City Preventative Patrol Experiment, you've probably heard about this before in your intro classes or something like that, and this is essentially, their theory was that they increased motorized patrols that will lead to lower crime, but then they found that this really had no effect on crime or fear of crime and things like that. So they really found that in areas where they increased patrols, it didn't have any effect on crime. Which was pretty interesting. And so if you look at here's a little graph where they show the differences. I think I got a laser pointer in here somewhere. Yeah. So you see the reactive beats where there was absolutely no patrol going on. It was one of the areas of the city. Then they had the control beats where it was just kind of business as usual. They patrolled as they normally did. And then they had the proactive beats where they had actually put 2 or 3 times the amount of normal police in that area. And across all of these different areas, they found that there was no effect on crime. And so this has really reduced a lot of motivation to put, patrols out there and say, we have to go and patrol, which is oftentimes why you see officers sitting on the side of the road and things like that, hanging out just waiting on the next call or trying to catch speeders in the interim or something like that, because we see that, this has been a pretty well-known study out there that has shown that there's really no effect on crime. But there were some issues with that, some limitations of that, so to speak. And so one of the things was that, even in the reactive areas where you didn't have patrol, you still had some police presence because police were still driving through there when they were responding to calls. The second one was that citizens weren't aware of this experiment. So they may or may not have noticed the increased amount of, police patrol in an area if they're paying attention. I'm in my basement right now. And if there was an increased patrol in my neighborhood, I wouldn't know about it. I haven't left the house all day because it's coronavirus. But anyway. And then there's a few other, things down there. Is the visibility really going to deter crime, or people just going to wait for that police car to drive by and then, commit their crime after that? So another one was one car was replaced in 2 to 3 proactive beats, which is about 2 square miles. 2 square miles is a pretty big area. So if you have, 2 to 3 more cars in that area, would anybody really notice that? That's, another issue there. If areas had very little crime, then preventive patrol wouldn't really prevent it because there's no crime to prevent, which is, I think, a funny one. And then the idea that, patrol might affect some crimes but not others. Domestic violence, for example, it happens inside the home. So, you're probably not going to be as deterred by increased patrols in the area if, you're committing domestic violence. Now, if you're, robbing people on the street corners or something like that, doing something like that outside, that might be more likely that you would, stop engaging in that behavior if you notice that there's increased patrols. So the Kansas City Hotspot Patrol Experiment, and remember, this is a separate experiment. So you have the Kansas City Patrol Experiment, and you have the Kansas City Hotspot Patrol Experiment. So just think of one of them as a hotspot patrol, and the other one is just regular patrol. I know it's difficult to keep them separated sometimes, but the hotspot one, the one that we're talking about now, was dealing with guns and hotspots to reduce the amount of gun violence. And so they found that, when they were out there proactively seizing guns, they did actually find that they had less gun crime. They were trying to build on some of those limitations of the previous study, so they said, we're just going to focus on gun crime, because gun crime is something that's out there. It's not really occurring in the house most of the time, although people do shoot people in their own homes. But this is something that we can think that, okay, if we reduce the number of guns out there in these hotspots, this should lead to less crime. And so that experiment actually found that that did occur. Another thing that they found was that there was no displacement. And so for those of you that don't know or didn't understand quite exactly what this meant in your textbook, displacement means, well, if we have increased patrols or something in one area, well, the theory is that if we put a bunch of police in one area, then criminals are just going to go to another area to commit their crimes, right? So if you have 10 cops at, this Publix, nobody's going to go and, steal beer from that Publix. They'll go to the Kroger down the street. So that's the idea of displacement, that you're not really preventing the crime, you're just moving it to another geographic area. They found that with this experiment, no displacement occurred because they knew to look for that. But anyway, so comparing these two, the Kansas City Preventative Patrol Experiment and the Kansas City Hotspot Experiment. So the Hotspot Experiment focused on small, high crime areas because remember, we want to focus on an area that has high crime, not low crime, so that way we can try to bring it down compared to the larger areas with no crime in the original experiment. So there was a greater level of patrol in a smaller area in the hotspot experiment than there was with that 2-mile radius in the original experiment as well. And the hotspot experiment increased police activities compared to visibility, and like I said, they focused only on gun crime. So they tried to build on a lot of those limitations that I mentioned with the first experiences. So there's some things, some other stuff that you've probably seen before, police crackdowns, increased police presence and enforcement activity. A great example of this is your field sobriety or your sobriety checkpoints for DUIs, right? We're going to crack down on this. We're going to set up roadblocks and check people and make sure they're not drunk driving and things like that. And so that's a good example of that. You'll have what is known as initial deterrent effect, where while you're doing the checkpoint, you have some deterrent effect because people are going to be like, whoa, there's a checkpoint. I'm not going to drink and drive tonight. But then there's also the residual deterrence that, hey, the cops are cracking down on this. Maybe we shouldn't drink and drive even after that sobriety checkpoint is down. And this would occur after that back-off period. So the back-off period would be after this crackdown is over with, so to speak. Traffic stops. You all are going to watch a whole video on traffic stops. It's actually a police training video that goes into all of the nuts and bolts of traffic stops. So I will not dwell on that too much because you're going to watch a whole other half an hour on that. But anyway, essentially stopping people for traffic violations. These can lead to arrests for other offenses, and they often do. A lot of times they'll stop people for petty things, and then they'll catch them doing something else. Ted Bundy was actually caught in a traffic stop for something stupid. So, be careful out there if you're, driving and your license is suspended or something like that. You shouldn't be driving anyway, but, you can get caught for additional things, or if you've been drinking, or anything else that undergraduate students do these days. So, they have some crime reduction benefits, obviously, by getting, criminals off the streets, catching the more serious criminals. Traffic violations in and of themselves, I guess you could say lead to a safer area. Downside is they can lead to vehicle pursuits. Many departments are actually coming up with no pursuit policies. I was actually talking with I forget officers at KSU the other day, and they had this guy run, and the officer ran from him, and he was on foot, and he chased him for a little while, and then eventually he stopped and said, okay, and he let him go. And then the senior officer, I won't tell you the name, he goes and he says, well, why did you stop chasing him? Why didn't you keep running after him? He said, well, we have a no pursuit policy. We're not supposed to pursue people. And for those of you that don't know, police officers don't tend to really like running after people. Carrying all that stuff is pretty heavy, and it's really exhausting, especially in Georgia when it's hot. But it was funny that, obviously the no pursuit policy doesn't apply to foot pursuits, but he was being sarcastic. But that's what he told the senior officer. Anyway, so Terry stops are another means of patrol. You've probably heard of the New York stop and frisk, which is very controversial. We'll talk more about Terry stops when we get to that section on law and constitutional law and criminal procedure. For now, just know that it came from Terry versus Ohio, and essentially says, that anybody who has, if an officer has a reasonable suspicion to believe that an individual is engaged in criminal activity, that he can stop them and then question them and see what they're up to. If they reasonably believe that they might have weapons on them, they can pat them down. Now, they can't go into their pockets. They can't search them, so to speak. They can just pat them down. If you have a gun in your pants, it creates a bit of a bulge, and so they'll be able to detect that. One thing that students often struggle with is that the burden of proof is a reasonable suspicion, and it's not probable cause. And so when you look at your burden of proof in a criminal matter, you're going to have reasonable suspicion, and then you'll have probable cause, and then, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You use these for different things. Reasonable suspicion only applies to stop and frisks. Probable cause applies to several things, right? Like searches, arrests, things like that. You have to have probable cause to arrest or to search somebody, but you only need a reasonable suspicion to stop someone and to frisk them. And the court defined a reasonable suspicion as specific articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that this person was engaged in criminal activity or was about to engage in criminal activity. Specific articulable facts. And they can't be that the suspect was black. That is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional, and that's the problems that New York got in trouble with. So that's what leads to part of the controversy. You can't just stop everybody that you see and say, well, I saw them here. So when it comes to patrol, and you've probably seen sometimes that officers ride alone, or sometimes that there's two officers in a car. Most of the time when you see two officers in a car, you're going to see it's probably related to training. One of the officers is probably in training, and the other one is training them. And there's some areas where two officers will ride together. Some departments do that, but then you're stretching your resources further. You're putting two cops in one car where you could have two cars go, elsewhere. Officers like two-officer cars. It makes them feel safer. Interestingly, the research actually shows that officers are more likely to be assaulted if they're in a two-officer car, but they're less likely to be shot. And the theory is that officers, when there's two of them in the car, one of them gets a little bit more cocky and then gets the other one into a fight. But they haven't really empirically tested that. But they've also tested the fact that one-officer units are at least equal to and often more advantageous than two-officer units. So it's easier to just have one officer per car. It saves you money. You're not paying two salaries of two people to be doing the same thing. And then you're not in the car by yourself, too. So there's a reason. Of course, officers like it better. Research on foot patrol. Impact on crime reduction is really mixed. But citizen attitudes towards police were more positive. So foot patrol doesn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on crime itself, and the same goes for bike patrol pretty much too. However, what will happen is it actually increases citizen satisfaction, and it can actually reduce fear of crime. So people actually perceive that crime has gone down in an area if there's officers on foot patrol and things, even though that's not necessarily the case. I think foot patrol could be a good thing to some extent if it's helping citizen attitudes towards the police to be more positive. I'd say that we could really use more of that right now. Provided the police are being nice to the citizens as they meet them and not stopping them and frisking them and harassing them, which I'm sure they would never do, right? The problem with foot patrol, though, is it really limits the officer's ability to travel and go very far, right? If he gets a call for, someplace that's, 5 miles away, he can't walk there. He's got to walk all the way back to his car, then get to his car, and then drive there or something like that, so it can slow things down. A lot of times you'll see with large events, there you might have foot patrols and things like that, and those are officers that are just dedicated to that event, so they're not going to have to go very far. And that can be more effective in certain situations. You think about Baltimore still does a lot of foot patrol and things like that, of course, in a high traffic area, right? Foot patrol could be effective because you can usually walk places faster than you can drive, but then you can get your bicycles or the what are the things they stand up on called? Segways. The segways, and use those, and there's all sorts of other things that can be used to get around traffic and much faster than driving. So, offender-focused strategies. One thing that you may or may not have heard of in criminology and criminal justice, but if you don't remember it now, you'll probably hear about it in some other classes too, is something called the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule, the basic idea with that is that 80% of the crime is committed by 20% of the population. It also says that 80% of the crime is committed in 20% of an area. So if you have Cobb County, for example, there's going to be pockets of crime areas that are known as hotspots, and that 20% of the county is where 80% of the crime is going to occur. So police tend to focus their efforts on these high-rate offenders in these high-rate areas, right? The high-rate offenders tend to live in the high-rate areas. Go figure, right? Or at least that's where they go to commit their crimes. Oh, was that it? I guess so. Okay. Well, that was all that I had. It was about 23 minutes. So with that, I will bid you all adieu. Be sure to do your quiz and your discussion board on this. And email me if you have any other questions about police patrol. I feel like it was pretty straightforward, but, obviously I'm here if you have any questions. Okay, thanks.